how do you describe your old job to people? Like, if you're at a cocktail party or something, what do you tell people that you used to do?
So generally, I try to avoid it. I was a coach. When my kids were growing up, I coached, my son and my daughters, all their different sports. I'm a baseball guy, so I coached baseball for years. And kind of like at the end of Little League, one of the dads came up to me and said, "You're an astronaut." And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "I've been on your team for years. No one ever said anything." I'm like, "I know. I was worried about, teaching them how to turn a double play and, how to hit the cutoff man. I wasn't worried about being an astronaut." So I normally don't say anything unless somebody asks.
Okay, so this is astronaut Terry Virts, our special guest for today's show. And the reason I decided to start asking Terry Virts some questions, space questions in particular, is because this happened.
3, 2, 1, ignition. And liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V, carrying 2 American heroes.
It was supposed to be an 8-day mission. But problems with the Boeing Starliner means 2 of NASA's astronauts will now spend around 8 months in orbit.
Starliner, where there was a little bit of action the other day.
Pilot Sunita Suni Williams and Commander Barry Butch Bullmore were the first to man Boeing's new spacecraft, blasting off on the 5th of June. But issues with the Starliner's propulsion system kept delaying their return home. They've now been stranded in space for more than 2 months, with NASA saying the planned return on the Starliner would be too dangerous.
All which is to say that these 2 astronauts, Commander Butch Wilmore and pilot Suni Williams, are stuck, as you may have heard, in space. They've been stranded there thanks to a series of Boeing technical disasters at a place known as the International Space Station, where their 8-day test mission is now going to stretch into an 8-month ordeal, ending, according to NASA, in February 2025. And so what I wanted to do is find out what being stuck in space actually entails these days. Which brings us back to the former Little League coach in question.
Hello, I'm Terry Virts, NASA astronaut and commander of the International Space Station, the world's outpost in low Earth orbit. Living and working in this magnificent laboratory with my Russian and European crewmates would not...
As this 2015 video from space confirms, Terry Virts had what I believe to be the most sci-fi job title in American history. The dude was the commander of the International Space Station, which is also known as the largest space station ever built, and now the place that those 2 astronauts have been stranded. And so as much as Terry had been reluctant to tell his fellow dads any of this stuff back home in Houston, he agreed to make an exception on account of his newest job title, which he accepted at age 56. PTFO's first ever Outer Space Correspondent.
Sometimes I'll talk about space because it's very cool. Most people don't know. Most people haven't been there, and I get it.
Hold on.
It's pretty cool.
Hold on. Terry Virts, the statement, most people haven't been there, when there is space, feels like a bit of an understatement as we get going into this conversation.
Yeah, when I was on the station one night, we were having dinner. There's 6 of us on the space station at the time, and the Russian segment has this really cool window. So I would always try and eat dinner with the Russians, and we were looking out the window, and I said, "Look at that, guys, look out there." And everybody looked out, and I said, "There's over 6 billion people down there, and there's only 6 of us. We're literally 1 in a billion." So, there's a sense of duty. Like, you have to do something.
Yes.
You've been given a pretty cool gift.
Yeah, which is to say that if you're telling my kid, you gotta, slide into home, I want to know that the former commander of the International Space Station is the person telling him to get down.
It's kind of like being an airline pilot. You are the captain of the airplane, but air traffic control is going to tell you where to go. Turn to heading 270, descend at 10,000 feet. So you do what you're told most of the time. But when the engine catches on fire, then all of a sudden hey, there were an emergency. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. So your job really has 2 phases. And thankfully, 99% of the time is not emergency. 99% of the time is, normal.
All right, so there is another important detail that you need to understand here about Commander Terry Virts. And it relates to those emergency scenarios that he very knowingly alluded to just a minute ago. What you need to know is that I wanted to talk to Terry because in 2015, he also got stranded at the International Space Station. Not unlike America's two currently stuck astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, whose malfunctioning Boeing Starliner recently reminded NASA of previous shuttle tragedies.
Still haunted by the Challenger and Columbia disasters that killed 14 astronauts, mission managers decided last month they will not risk putting Williams and Wilmore on a Starliner with engine thrusters that could potentially malfunction on re-entry.
Butch and Suni recently held a joint press conference, notably, from the ISS, in which they got asked by reporters what Boeing could have done differently with the development of the Starliner. And Commander Wilmore attempted to strike a pretty diplomatic note.
I'll say this. There is not enough time right now to go into all the details to make any answer I think that I could give make complete sense. I could say a few things and it would be taken the wrong way, a way that I didn't mean it to be. So for questions...
All of which just made me want to ask Terry Virts what had happened to his ride back home in 2015.
The last flight I was on was supposed to be 169 days, and this American Cygnus cargo ship blew up right before we launched, and then a Russian Progress cargo ship blew up while I was there.
And there is the view that we saw about 30 minutes or so ago, a clear rotational spin on the Progress 59 cargo craft. It was reported by our visiting vehicle officer here in Mission Control to Flight Director.
And then a SpaceX Dragon cargo ship blew up at the end of our mission. So when the Russian one blew up, it's the same rocket and capsule that humans launch on. Thankfully, this was an unmanned vehicle, but humans fly on it too. So they didn't want to launch our replacement crew until they did the investigation to see what was wrong. And they didn't want to send us back to Earth until the replacement crew is ready to replace us. So they basically said, hey, you're stuck in space. We don't know for how long. And oh, by the way, you're low on supplies because we've had 2 of your cargo ships blow up. So we were low on underwear. We were low on food. So it ended up being a month. So the 169-day turned into 200 days.
But the idea of you're going to be stuck in space, it doesn't sound like your immediate reaction was, oh my God, this is a nightmare.
The first question we needed answered was, did this Russian rocket blowing up have the same problem that might affect our capsule? So we wanted to make sure that that same thing wasn't going to happen to us. And it turned out it wasn't. And then the next question was, when are we coming back? This has happened several times. There's been astronauts that got stuck, got delayed or whatever, never as dramatically as the 2 Boeing astronauts. And usually it's like they're not happy. There's some sad astronauts up there. They're like, ah. But for our guys, there was 3 of us. And I think we all said, you know what? This is my time in space. We're just going to enjoy it. I got the rest of my life on Earth. Let's just enjoy it. We had that attitude, and that helped a lot. But the people that really suffer are the families. Like my family on Earth, I was supposed to be home for the summer. If there's kids, and dad's late from work, mom's getting mad, well, I was like a month late from work.
Wait, so just to get a big picture view, though, of your brain as you're processing these headlines, and you're seeing what the Boeing Starliner is and is not doing, and you're thinking of these 2 astronauts who are where you were, right? Yeah. A person in Butch who followed you in this lineage of commanders of the ISS. Your reaction is what, emotionally, as you imagine it?
When it was going to be a month or 2, I remember thinking, this is great. These guys are happy. Now, they probably didn't have enough T-shirts and underwear, and they didn't have special food that they ordered. So there were some inconveniences, but this is bonus time in space. They're both probably roughly 60 years old. They're not the youngest astronauts, so I don't know if they're going to fly again or not, but they might not. So, this is just bonus time in space. But when it went to like an extra 6 months, or I think 8 months total, whatever it is, it's a lot. And that's a lot. That's a long extension. This guy, Polyakov, was this Russian cosmonaut. I think he launched as a Soviet and landed as a Russian, or it was back in the early 90s. Or no, it must have been Russia, but they basically were broke. And so they didn't have a ride for him home. So he was literally stuck in space for over 400 days.
You know, one of the stupid questions that I have that I immediately feel obliged to ask you is when you're stuck in space for however many extra weeks, do you get paid more? Like, is there like,
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. How does this work financially for you if you're stuck in space?
So people always ask, and they're like, well, how's your NASA pension or whatever? You know, like, I don't get one, and I just did back surgery. That was I have insurance, but it's not from NASA. It's military. I was in the military, so all those copays are coming out of my own pocket. So yeah, when you're at NASA as an astronaut, you get every time you have a mission, you get 2 Land's End polo shirts, and that's pretty much it. Like, and we usually the guys order a Land's End 3-in-1 jacket because it's like more expensive than a cotton polo shirt. So it's kind of funny, but sort of not, but it's funny. I'm not complaining at all. I had the most amazing experience of all time.
But I want to know this stuff. I want to know what it's really like.
Buzz Aldrin has tweeted this out. It's pretty funny. I talked to Buzz yesterday. So when you're in space, it used to be $3.50, now it's $5. So I got $5 a day per diem. If I'm at NASA and I have to go to some conference in Colorado Springs, they'll buy you a coach airline ticket. You stay at the hotel that's under the government rate, the Holiday Inn Express, and you get, $69 a day for meals and expenses. But when you're in space, you don't have any expenses. But there's still, quote unquote, incidental expenses. So NASA pays you $5 a day and it's tax deductible. So I was in space for 200 days. I literally got a check for $1,000.00. And that was my thing. But my European colleague would never say how much she was getting, but I think it was a couple $100 a day. It was kind of secret. They weren't saying it, but I think the Europeans, look, they
felt bad for you, it sounds like.
The astronaut center's in Germany. So if you're Italian or French or Norwegian or whatever, you get like tax-free and like 50% bonus. You get all kinds of benefits for being an astronaut just because for having to rough it in the terrible location of Germany. So she made a couple hundred, but my Russian, and by the way, the Russians do capitalism much better than we do. He was getting $1,000 a day. So it's an interesting difference. And it's funny, when I talk to kids, you get the same questions all the time. And one of the questions that high schoolers will ask you is, how much do you get paid? People are interested.
I believe you just said that I have the journalistic curiosity of a high schooler.
Which is pretty good.
I do want to explain the ISS, the International Space Station, because I did not fully appreciate what this was until I started reading your book and doing all of this research and just like examining it more closely in photos, because this thing was launched in 1998. And I think this superlative is worthwhile in terms of a thing people on Earth should be aware of. This is the longest continuous human presence in space.
Since November of 2000, we've had humans in space.
Right. And so this being a partnership between the United States and Russia specifically, I think is something that we need to be aware of too.
Although Russia's economic problems have put the project a whole year behind schedule, the fact that the first Russian component was successfully launched will have brought huge sighs of relief from here in the Kremlin.
So in the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. George H.W. Bush was president. And it was a miracle. I mean, it was truly miraculous. This evil empire with 5,000 nuclear weapons or tens of thousands, it collapsed peacefully without a shot being fired, which was a miracle. And Dan Quayle was the vice president. The vice president was in charge of space policy. That's usually the case. So Ronald Reagan had wanted to do Space Station Freedom, an American space station. And then when this happened, the big concern was all these Russian scientists are now out of work. The Russian economy was a disaster. They said, well, why don't we bring them in? So there was the International Space Station. So Europe and Japan and Canada, and at the time, Brazil, they eventually dropped out. All these nations got together. And the real goal was to give the Russians something to do. And there was money being transferred, and we kept their space program alive for decades. They also returned the favor when we had our space shuttle accident. And when we shut down the shuttle program, we didn't have a way to get there. And I launched on a Russian Soyuz. So it was, it's been a mutually beneficial partnership.
And just to clarify what Terry is saying there, America does not have a space shuttle program anymore. You may have missed this, but the US government officially shut it down in 2011 on account of cost, and even more infamously, on account of safety. The aforementioned Space Shuttle Columbia accident, where the entire spacecraft disintegrated as it re-entered the atmosphere, killing all 7 astronauts on board, had taken place in 2003. And so this is why Terry Virts, who is also, by the way, a veteran fighter pilot and colonel in the Air Force, wound up riding a Russian spacecraft to the ISS in 2015. And it's also why these private companies like Boeing and SpaceX are racing to fill the void by developing new commercial spacecraft that can also maybe end our reliance in this way on the Russian government. All of which has led to a new set of mechanical problems, of course, the kind that leaves Terry Virts and Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams stuck aboard the ISS. And the ISS, somehow, still persists, literally above the geopolitical fray, as a pretty remarkable diplomatic experiment.
Yes, it is.
I mean, this is a solar-powered diplomatic instrument that is in space, and it has these 2 wings, apparently. So there is the US orbital segment and the Russian orbital segment. And in my mind, I'm immediately like, oh, is this like dorms at a college? Like, how do you explain the
men's
diplomacy?
dorm and the women's dorm.
Yeah, exactly. And all of the parietals and all of these rules therein, maybe. But how is it actually when you're up there?
The astronauts operated as one spaceship. I made a really strong effort because I was there during Crimea. The Russians annexed Crimea. They started the war in Donbass. I actually watched bombs going off in Donbass. One night in January 2015, Sasha Samokutyaev, my Russian crewmate, and I, we were looking out that same window and saw little red flashes.
Just to clarify, you saw bombs from space.
We saw the bombs going off from space.
Man, what is that experience like? Just the because it's surreal what you're describing right now.
I remember thinking, I can hear God speaking. Like I'm seeing creation from God's point of view. Humans are not meant to see. It's so beautiful. Like it's so beautiful. I remember my 5th night in space. On my first flight was on a space shuttle, and we flew over the Mediterranean, and you could see like Israel and Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan. They're all right. They're like that. They're right next to each other. And I remember thinking, what's the problem, guys? You all live right next to each other. Like, what's the big deal? And that's obviously a naive, way to look at the world. But that's what I felt when I looked at it.
Just as I continue to sort of like map the ISS for for my audience and in my own brain, by the way, this is not the USS Enterprise. Right? This is not a thing with a big bridge. How would you describe the actual structure of it?
The ISS is modules. And so, like you said, there's a Russian segment, American segment, and they're very different. The Russians, it looks like it's the Soviet Union in the 1970s. The American segment is really America plus Japan plus Europe plus Canada. Canada built their robotic arms. But we all use the same voltage. We use the same data and, in the same module. It just looks the same, whereas theirs looks very different. The modules are about the size of a school bus. So I don't know how long they are, maybe 30 feet long, maybe 40 feet long. I think they're 15 feet in diameter because that was the size of the space shuttle. But there's a bunch of equipment. So it's a human wingspan. I could not put myself where I couldn't touch something. So just imagine that. Like if you're an average sized man and stick out your hands, if you were in the middle of the space station, you'd be able to touch something. And that's about how big it is.
Right. And I should note also that you personally, you did help finish the assembly of the ISS. The cupola is a term I also want people to be aware of, because if I were to want to go to space, it would be because I'd want to be inside of this part of the ISS.
You are 100% right. That's what 99% of people would love. My logo, I have my logo. That's the cupola. That's kind of the view of Earth out of the cupola. Cupola is kind of a common word in Europe. There's cupolas everywhere. It's like the dome on top of a building or on top of a church. So it has 6 windows around you and then one big, huge one above you. So it's kind of like a bay window in your kitchen. Back in the 80s, they used to make these little bay windows that stuck out.
Yes.
So just think of it like a bay window. And the real reason for it is to do robotics. So there's a robotic control station. You go in there and you can move the robotic arm and you can actually look at it. You don't need to have windows. You can just use video monitors, but it's cooler to look out. But it's really cool to see the Earth. So I helped make an IMAX movie called A Beautiful Planet.
Terry, I should say, I watched A Beautiful Planet.
Oh, wow.
In IMAX, very high.
On Earth, we have everything we need to survive. Air to breathe and food and water to sustain life. It's incredible the effort that was needed to design this life support system flying around the planet.
Aboard the International Space Station, a crew of astronauts from around the globe.
And it was one of the greatest cinematic experiences of my life. To be stoned watching giant Terry Virts, I would later discover.
You saw my nude scene.
I did. I did. It was sensuous. You lathering yourself up.
I got paid twice as much as my crewmates did for doing that scene. 2 times 0. How do you shower in space? That's a common question. So I'm in there basically with a wet towel and soap.
Yes, just squirting bits of liquid onto your head. Yeah.
And if you see it in the theater, it's 3D. So there's water,
It was a lot for me to process.
If you're stoned, it's probably even better.
Precisely.
So the cupola is the best thing.
Yes.
It's the coolest place on Earth or off Earth.
Right. So I'm imagining one of the silver linings to being stuck up in space for 9 months or whatever it is they get to look out at this thing. And I'm curious, what are the things on Earth, the parts of Earth that would most cause you to gather together and be like, we got to watch this. You don't want to miss this part of our planet.
The aurora. The aurora are just amazing. It doesn't happen often. You only see the northern lights in June, July, and you only see the southern lights in January, December. And the sun's not always active, but when it's active and when it launches these giant explosions towards Earth, about a day later, all the particles get here and the magnetic field captures them. There's nothing like it. I saw 23 different tropical storms, and my SAC is by far the biggest, most impressive. And there's a video of us flying over this thing in the IMAX movie. The thing about that, the eye was so huge. It was the biggest ever Pacific super typhoon. It was huge. It was scary. You look at Earth and there's this giant eye there. It was really kind of scary.
What were the parts of Earth in terms of the cities that stick in your brain still when you remember what the cupola was revealing to you?
You know what city really sticks out to me, and this is weird? Buenos Aires. On the east coast of South America, there's this triangular water. I don't know what it is, the bay of something. And Montevideo's on the north side. It's small. Buenos Aires is huge, and it's on the south side. And it's the only city I really noticed during the day. If you're looking at London, if you're looking at New York, you can see them. They're concrete. But unless you're looking for them, you won't notice them. During the daytime, if you were an alien and you flew by Earth, you wouldn't notice people. But at nighttime, you see city lights. And at nighttime, that's when you see people. And as I thought about it, and I was looking at Earth at night, it hit me that at nighttime, what you're seeing is not population, what you're seeing is wealth. And especially flying over Africa, there's just no lights on. There's a few, the Nile, Johannesburg, Nigeria, there's a few places, but most of Africa is dark, and that's because of politics and corruption. And you're watching the bad side of human nature from space. That was something I never thought I would see. Or the good side, like Western Europe, tons of lights. America, tons of lights. South Korea, huge amounts of lights. South Korea is an amazingly successful economically country. And North Korea is just a black hole. It's a complete disaster.
let's just stay on this track of just like stuff I've always wondered, right? That I want to find out about.
Yeah.
The sensation, right? I watch movies, I see the videos, and you guys are floating. But is that the word? Again, I want to get the vocabulary right here. Are you floating? What does it feel like?
Yeah, no, it is the word. And what it feels like, it's not zero G. It's not like there's no gravity. Of course, everywhere in the universe there's gravity. And we're only a few hundred miles away from Earth. So there's a lot of gravity from Earth. Thank God, or we wouldn't orbit. We would just fly off. But it feels like you're falling because you're falling. So I do this demo. Here, I got my Diet Coke. So if I drop this on Earth, a second later, it would hit the ground, right? In space, on the space station, if I let go of my Diet Coke, it would fall almost the same distance towards the center of the Earth. But in that 1 second, we would have moved forward 5 miles. So it's this combination of falling and moving and falling and moving, and it makes an arc.
What you're telling me is that the feeling of being in space is that of being perpetually falling?
Yes, that's exactly what it feels like. So especially for like rookies or not professional kind of people who've thought about it and trained, this is the reaction. That's what...
Yeah, you're flapping your arms, right?
I don't know why God made us do that or evolution made us do that, but this is what people do. It feels like when you jump off of... I always tell this joke. We used to have diving boards before we had lawyers, right? So you can jump and you can feel what it's like in space for 1 second before you hit the water. If you're in an airplane going really fast, the pilot can push over and the airplane does what's called a parabola, and you can feel weightlessness for 10 or 20 or 30 seconds, depending on how fast you're going. Or you could do it for 40 seconds and hit the ground, right? So, but in space, because you're going so fast, you're just perpetually falling. And that's what it feels. That's what your brain thinks is happening.
This is where I demand that you give me your take on extraterrestrial life, obviously. It's my contract as a podcaster that I must ask the astronaut, the commander of the ISS,
it's required,
about it.
So here's my take. First of all, I haven't seen anything. There are billions of planets out there. You'd think there's life, right? But even so, at the bottom line, whatever side of that argument you fall on, those planets are far, 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 far away. A light year is a long distance. And the nearest stars are like dozens or hundreds of light years away. The farther stars are hundreds of thousands of light years away, or the galaxies are millions and billions of light years away. So it's going to be a long time before we get any kind of spaceships that can travel that far. So I don't know. We'll see. That's all I'm allowed to say in public.
I was going to say, this got real suspicious towards the end there. I was like, we'll see. What are we?
I'm joking. But the other thing is, it was like, okay, if you have the capability to put yourself in a spaceship and fly across the galaxy, why would you go to Roswell, New Mexico? Like, I'd go to New York, get some sushi. I'd go to the Bahamas on the beach. I go to Mount Everest and see the big mountain. I wouldn't go to Roswell. Like, what the? And if I could fly across the galaxy, I'd probably be able to land. They all crash when they get here. They all crash.
Right.
So, you know.
What you're telling me is that alienexpedia.com is just horrible. It's just like the ratings are all off.
I need to check on that.
Something about your position as commander of the ISS. I am curious, what are the perks? If you're the commander, what powers do you have that you got to exercise that others couldn't?
You get probably the most important power. You get to set the temperature. So if you want the temp, it's like in a marriage, you know, you're the one who controls the thermometer.
What was Terry Virts setting the temperature at?
It was like 73 or something, the same as I have my house here in Houston. It was just normal. I mean, you wear your Land's End polo shirt, and they're like biker policeman shorts they give us, you know, tactical shorts with Velcro all over them, so that if you have, you know, whatever, your mouse with some Velcro, you just stick it to your shorts and it stays there.
Velcro, I'm getting the sense, was a very important technological innovation for you guys.
Dude, Velcro, without Velcro, you couldn't fly in space. I kept a Sharpie in my biker policeman shorts, but they always had a little Velcro thing, so you could just stick it there and then you go, vroom, write it on whatever and put it back and you're good to go.
There is a poetry, though, to the idea of here you are at the height of technological innovation as a species, as humanity has achieved it, and Velcro.
And the drinks, so we have these, they're like Capri Sun. They're silver drink bags. You put a straw in that clamps off so it doesn't leak. And you can have coffee, tea, milk, smoothies. The fruit drinks was everybody's favorite, actually. And it's Tang. We actually drink Tang.
Man.
The Tang company makes NASA's powder for our astronaut drinks. Or they did anyway 10 years ago when I was flying.
Wait, so just food-wise, astronaut ice cream, a real thing that you enjoyed, or just a thing at museums that they sell to kids?
It's a thing at museums. I never had that in space. I don't know anybody who's ever had that in space. But it's good. It's kind of cool. But the ice cream I had was Ben and Jerry's. So we have freezers for biology samples. So I did a lot of rodent research, a lot of human blood and urine, and swab your mouth out and whatever. Just we had fish, whatever. Biology decays. So we put it in a freezer, and then a couple months later, the scientists on Earth can study it. But going up, they're not sending up our samples, right? So it's empty. So one time they filled up a freezer full of ice cream. So we had Klondike bars, we had Chunky Monkey.
What was the food like in terms of the Russian wing segment versus the American segment?
So you have, they call them bobs. It was just an acronym for a bag of food. And you'd have like your meat bob and your veggies and your desserts and drinks and whatever. There were and snacks. So and each one was like 8 days worth of food for a crew of 3 or whatever. So you'd open it up and like the shrimp cocktail would go first. The Mexican scrambled eggs would go first. There was a few things that everybody loved. And then by the end of it, you're down to like the stuff that nobody liked. But then you could order your own food. And I think I got 2 or 3. I forgot how many. I got a few of these bobs with food I wanted. So I could order beef jerky or whatever. But I ordered Russian food. So I as part of my crew preference, like my desired food was Russian food. I love borscht. I got Russian borscht. They do the best mashed potatoes. Kartoffel puree was great. Fish, NASA doesn't do fish. I don't know why. The only fish we had was like a bag of star-kissed tuna. So the Russians have lots of fish. So I ordered some of that. And it's like cat food. They come in these little cat food tin cans and you peel it. So it's not the most appealing thing, but it tastes really good.
Wait, so when you imagine what's going on up there right now, in terms of what's being run out of, what they're using to sustain themselves, how do you explain what that scene is like at the moment?
So it's funny. I'm working on a project with the former head of food for NASA. And I was just talking to her a few weeks ago. And they have these charts. There's a whole office at NASA of people that track, we call them consumables. How much oxygen, how much water, clothes, propellant, all the stuff you burn through, that you got to resupply. And as you can imagine, you got to keep track of that. You don't want to suddenly run out. I used to think there was like a year or 2 years worth of stuff. And she said, no, we had 6 months worth of reserve food. And now they're taking it down to 4 months just to save space because the station is full. It's like there's no extra room. So when all of a sudden there's 2 extra crewmates for a few months, there's enough margin there. But as long as the cargo ships keep on going, if they have a few different cargo ships blow up, it could become a problem. But the big thing for them, I think, is tennis shoes because you got to exercise. Exercise is super important. If you're there for a week or 2, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to be there for 6 months, exercise is important. And you have to have tennis shoes. The 3 big American exercise machines require shoes. So I don't know if they launch with them or not. For an 8-day mission, you don't need shoes. So
right. And the exercise dynamic, that is physiologically necessary because why?
So you basically lose bone and muscle mass. And it never ends. Like what we've measured is it's a linear straight line. It doesn't like level out. I think after a couple years, you would be a jellyfish. Like you wouldn't be able to come back to Earth. The gravity would kill you, I think. But thankfully, we've never gotten to that point. So they have exercise machines. When I was there, I took vitamin D. You get vitamin D by going outside and your body makes vitamin D when it gets sunlight for whatever reason.
Right.
And you need that for bones. So I took a vitamin D tablet every day because there's no sun. You're in a metal can. There's lots of sun, but you're in a can, so you don't get it. And I exercise for 2.5 hours a day. And most astronauts lose some bone and muscle. But after 7 months, over 200 days, whatever, it's a long time, I lost 0.0% of my bone density because I was religious about the exercise. I did it every day.
All of it raises the question that, of course, the high schooler in me is demanding I ask, which is, okay, so the bathroom situation on the ISS is what? What does that look like?
The basic thing, here's the thing about going to the bathroom in space. On Earth, we have gravity, thank God, and that pushes everything in the right direction. So that keeps everything where it should be. In space, you don't have that. So you have airflow. So there's fans that basically the air blows and the air makes sure everything goes in the right direction. So there's a hose for number one and a can for number two. And so it's kind of a serial operation, not parallel, right? Like you can do both at the same time, but generally it's better to do one and then the other.
Yes.
And also the hose, as you can imagine, if there's a lot of sucking going on there and you get too close, yeah. So you got to be careful about that. That's not a pretty day. Because if you turn the fan off, now everything's floating.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Yeah. Accuracy and pace seem important in this physics
for the
equation.
can, you don't want to miss your target.
So this is when I feel like I should jump in here to point out that I feel like you might be wondering if I ever asked Terry Virts, astronaut, about sex at the International Space Station. And the answer obviously is yes. Although all Terry would tell me on the record is this.
It was a long 200 days for me. I don't know about anybody else, but I know it was the long 200 days.
But that same sentiment about the long 200 days, it brought me back to imagining the larger sensory experience of our two stranded astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams. Even beyond the trying to guide poop through the air part, or even the sampling of the borscht of a nation whose bombs you may simultaneously be watching from the cupola up above the atmosphere. Because while it is true that in the vacuum of space, nobody can hear you scream, the stuff you can hear inside the ISS itself is a very different auditory experience, it turns out. As Terry himself says he discovered one day, in the midst of his own stranding, when he noticed for the first time the sound of birds.
So one day I was floating through that middle module, node 1 we call it, where the food was, and I heard birds, and I stopped and I looked down at the exercise machine that I was talking about in node 3 that I had installed, and the Russian guy was down there working out, and I was like, "Hey, Misha," we had this conversation in Russian. I said, "Where's the bird?" And he laughed. The Russians had sent up sounds from Earth. So we had a jungle sound, we had rain, we had a busy cafe they understand psychology really well. And so we loved it. Everybody fell in love with this. So I would go in bed, put my headsets on and listen to rain. It was amazing. When I did that, the month I was doing that, I was actually started to dream of Earth. Normally, I just dreamt of the blackness of space and no dreams, but that month I was dreaming about Earth. It was pretty cool.
Wait, I was going to ask about what it's like to dream in space, and what you're saying is that absent some musical auditory stimulus reminder of our planet, you would just be in the blackness of infinity. You would be that way too.
Yeah, I mean, that's how my brain processed it. Like when I was sleeping, that all I remember is just black. Like the Empire Strikes Back. Remember when those asteroids were flying around and there was the big worm? And anyway, that was kind of the dreams I would have, just the blackness of space and asteroids and no color. But the month I listened to rain, sounds from Earth, my brain started dreaming about green fields and blue skies. And I also listened to Hans Zimmer's Interstellar soundtrack, which I think is the best soundtrack of all time. That movie came out right before I launched. In fact, I saw it in Russia, in a Russian movie theater before I launched. And so I kind of didn't really know what it had. I mean, I speak Russian, but not that great. And then I watched it in space. They sent up an American version, and I was like, that's what was happening there, you know. But the soundtrack is amazing. The Hans Zimmer Interstellar soundtrack is incredible.
How connected were you to the events happening on Earth when you were up there? Computer-wise, cell phone-wise, to what extent were you plugged in?
Yeah. So now they have WhatsApp. I'm actually WhatsApping with an astronaut on the space station today. We didn't have texting, but we did have email. And it used to be 20 years ago, the email would sync once a day. And then 10 years ago, it was syncing 3 times a day. And then it's pretty much always syncing now. So email is pretty good if a way to communicate. There's a phone system that's like FaceTime audio. As long as you have the internet connection, as long as your space station is talking to a satellite, you can call somebody. And it's the world's best phone. You can call anywhere on Earth for free. And then as you go around the Earth, you lose the satellite and it just cuts you off. The call is done. And so you never have to have a long goodbye with mom. It's like, click. All right, then you go on with your life. There's no goodbyes and they can't call you. So it's literally the perfect phone system. Except for when I was there, they didn't have contacts. So you literally had to type in the phone number, which is like, who knows phone numbers? So I had this sheet of paper with all these phone numbers written out.
Suddenly it was the 90s again. Yeah.
It was my time to get away from internet. You could actually log onto the internet, and one of the crewmates did that, but I was like, I never did. I didn't want the internet. It was like my 6 months away from the internet.
Right, wait. You were raw dogging space. You nothing, didn't need anything. Just you and the infinite blackness of the universe.
Exactly.
I've managed to laugh at the vast majority of what we've talked about today. But I also want to just remind people the degree to which every decision you made in space was also on some level a life or death impacting kind of choice, right?
Right.
Like, can you explain just the stakes of everything? Of just like how that sort of factored into how you lived and operated?
That you really have to have a personality that doesn't obsess about that, because you couldn't survive for 6 months. You can go over on a roller coaster for a minute and a half, and on my first flight, we're all crammed in the shuttle together. And then when we got to the station, you spread out. It's like a 747. So I slept in the European module called Columbus on the ceiling. And it was kind of new at the time. And anyway, all day and night, or whenever I was sleeping, it would go boom, like a submarine noise, like pinging on metal. And I think it was the sun heating and expanding and contracting the aluminum structure. But like, you just have to be okay with this space station that you're in is making banging noises and you don't know why. It's something that there's always danger there, and your mentality has to be, you're just not going to think about it. You're in the Air Force. They used to tell us, we actually had a psychologist come to our fighter squadron and talk to us. And of course, all the fighter pilots are like, not paying attention. But she was 100% right in that you guys compartmentalize. You put everything in your brain over here.
Yes.
And like that's great for being a fighter pilot. It's not great for being a husband. So you have to figure out like how to do your job and then how to have normal human relationships, which is not, we don't always succeed at everything. So
the self-selection of wanting to go to space, then the passing of all of the tests. I'm getting the sense that your advice for the people who are stuck there right now may not be the obvious stuff that I've even been belaboring here. It sounds like there's a psychological component that you're actually maybe even more acutely attuned to here.
Well, look, during the selection process, I think the psychological aspect is the most important thing, especially at the NASA level. There's a lot of great test pilots and fighter pilots. There was 100 other guys and gals that could have done exactly or better than what I was. But the psychological aspect, I think, is what really sets you apart. And that's kind of what's most important. Who do you want to spend months in space with? And if it was funny, when I did my interview, they don't tell you anything. But the psychologist afterwards was like, Terry, you were really great. You were like, your psychological profile was really good. So they're not supposed to tell you that, but he did tell me that. So the psychological aspect is probably the most important.
Yeah. I mean, look, you had alluded to some family dynamics that can become complicated when you are a compartmentalized former fighter pilot / commander of the International Space Station. How is that going for you back on Earth? How is that acclimation process towards civilian life?
It's funny. I was worried about it. A lot of astronauts struggle, and they, like every astronaut's favorite mission is his next mission. And I was worried am I going to want to, so I gave myself a year. I said, when you land, don't leave for a year. Some people leave immediately, some whatever. And I got to the point where I'm like, there's stuff I want to do. I'm still in my 40s. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I want to do things that I want to do. I'd been in the government for 30 years where you're told what to do. So I just said, it's time for me to go do other things. And when I landed in Russia, it's a 24-hour flight back to Houston. And then I went to the gym to work out because I was a fanatic about doing my rehabilitation. And then my son was there. And he had just turned 16. He had just gotten his driver's license while I was in space. Another thing that I missed. And he was like, Dad, let's go car shopping. So I said, all right. So he drove me to the Ford dealer and we looked at F-150s. And I was fine. I distinctly remember that drive. I remember seeing I-45, the highway, NASA Road 1. And I remember thinking, I'm on Earth. I'm back to normal. Like the light switch had switched. So for me personally, I compartmentalized. I had space in my space compartment and Earth in my Earth compartment. I just kind of had felt like, all right, I've 7 months. I've did an IMAX movie. I was commander. I did spacewalks. I kind of checked all the boxes, and that's how I looked at it.
But I'm curious if any part of you, however small, heard the story of these stranded astronauts and was in any way jealous of what they got to now go and still continue to do. Do you miss space, I guess, is the question.
Not really. You know what I would love to do would be to film a movie. If I could go back there, because like filmmaking is kind of what I want to do when I grow up. So if I had the opportunity to actually film a movie, I helped make A Beautiful Planet. I've done a few documentary and scripted films here on Earth, going to film something for a couple weeks starting tomorrow. So if I could do that, I think I would like to go back. But otherwise, there's a lot to do down here on Earth.
There's a whole lot to do down here on Earth.
And the food is okay in space, but it's better down here.
Terry Virts, the former commander of the International Space Station. Thank you for joining Pablo Torre Finds Out. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Pablo. This is an amazing podcast. I love your background too. That's a very cool. Oh,
background. Yeah. This is sort of like what it felt like inside of my brain when I was watching you super stoned in IMAX.
Excellent.
This has been Pablo Torre Finds Out, a Meadowlark Media production. And I'll talk to you next time.